Thank you for inviting me to discuss Blake's work. Since we're invited by the University of Toronto for this book discussion, I thought I should give a shout out to one of my favorite Canadian scholars, Harold Innis, who actually wrote about media, their distribution in time and space, and also about how the media of a given time shaped the culture of that period. He actually wrote about how communication media give rise to the rise and fall of empires. And ever since I started reading your book, Blake, for some reason I was reminded of Harold Innis, and I have been thinking about how your conception of videocassettes in Iran, the history of videocassette, relates to his ideas. So Harold Innis divided media into time-biased media and space-biased media. Time-biased media include clay or stone tablets, parchment and oral histories that have limited audiences, but that carry messages for many generations. And on the other hand, space-biased media include more mechanized modern technologies such as TV, radio, newspapers, and in this case, videocassettes that have wide circulation but short exposure times. So the more space-biased the media, the more they create monopolies of knowledge that shape public opinion and challenge notions of time, such as continuity, knowledge, and tradition. So Innis argued that each society required a balance between time-biased and space-biased media in order to thrive culturally. And his work was actually a critique of American culture and its over-reliance on space-biased media. So, of course, Innis's ideas were taken and expanded by scholars of media, and some of his ideas are actually kind of outdated now. But again, as I was reading your book, I just couldn't stop thinking about his ideas and thinking about how the videocassette as a media fits in this categorization. So your book emphasizes on what Innis would call a space-biased medium, which is small and could arguably be circulated widely. And through that, your book adds a new layer to Innis's theorization of media. The underground, in my opinion, here plays a huge role. So I could not help but think about how the underground and the channels of distribution, networks, oral histories, collective memories, and traditions that the videocassette and underground channels engendered made the videocassette a time-biased media that prompted continuity, for example, between pre- and post-revolutionary Iran, connection among Iranians and between Iran and the world, and facilitated remembering and cultural creativities and activities. In a committed act of remembering, you teach us or make us remember the videocassette, its underground distribution, its role in the lives of Iranians, and the ways in which it shaped culture and cultural activity. What you set out to do at the beginning of the book, to be honest with you, at first, to me, seemed like an impossible act. How is one to recover and reenact the underground? But in each chapter, you masterfully draw on trade magazine articles, official documents, memories, and oral histories to give us glimpses into the underground. And by the end of the book, the reader feels as if they have read and as if they have had access to the collective memories, stories, and cultural and political activities of the underground. And this is not a small feat. What I found the most fascinating in the book was how the story of videocassette is in a way a material history of the revolution itself, in that the way the story of videocassette more in the way that the history of videocassette more or less parallels the history of post-revolutionary Iran. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, as you showed, there is a period of cultural activity that coincides with the blossoming videocassette culture that, of course, enters a phase of decline with the beginning of the war. Then we enter the phase of videocassette ban from 1983 to 1994, which coincides with a period of heightened socio-political oppression and strangulation. The lifting of the ban in the 1990s coincides with a phase of reconstruction and opening, but in very limited ways. And then in the 2000s, it seems that, like the political affairs of the country in the first 2 decades of the new millennium, control over the videocassette is really messy and kind of out of the hand of the government. Throughout the chapters, the history of the videocassette, it is about the history of resistance, and as you just mentioned, about agency as well. So in a way, the history of videocassette becomes the material history of Iran in post-revolutionary era. Through its focus on materiality of this object, the videocassette, your book fits so well with the emergent scholarship on material culture before and after the revolution, namely Kaveh Askari's book on relaying cinema in mid-century Iran. And through your emphasis on the underground and informal channels of distribution, your book also fits very well with the nascent scholarship on informal economy, shadow economy, and informal employment in Iran. And in a way, you actually show that the informal economy kind of began during the war, even before the sanctions of the 2000s. So this was a fascinating book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it from cover to cover. For me, like many of the Iranians you have interviewed, this was a nostalgic history as much as an academic one, with contributions to, of course, media history, sociology, anthropology, and cinema. So congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Rekab-Talai. And now we go to Professor Askari, please.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, my connection is working. Yeah, thanks also for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with colleagues and friends, and some of you I've seen and communicated with extensively virtually, but never met in person. So it's good to see you all here. And taking part in the discussion of this exciting book is, I really want to kind of hit the ground running with this book and think about the ways that, we can learn from it and the ways that it's going to affect our scholarship moving forward. I think maybe some of my comments, I prepared some comments and they might overlap a little bit with Goldbach's, but hopefully more like a stereoscopic image so that we can resolve some kind of three-dimensional approach or picture of this book and what its interventions are. I want to say, first of all, I think some of us might even take for granted how rich and complicated the history of magnetic recording in Iran actually is. What I mean to say is it's not like this everywhere. I try to imagine a media historian whose primary interest is in magnetic recording technology, and it's difficult for me to imagine that historian being able to invent a more interesting hypothetical history, right? So there's something about this case that I think is really exciting and rich on its own, and we need to acknowledge that. And going all the way back to the 1950s, until the end of the 20th century, the fidelity, adaptability, and portability of magnetic recording offered distinct advantages in Iran. Versions of the technology played important roles in ongoing negotiations among media producers, dealers, consumers, and regulatory bodies. Dr. Atwood's Underground offers a history of the elusive ultimate chapter in the cultural life of the portable magnetic record in Iran, and that namely the hard plastic cases that shape the experience of moving image media for more than a decade. It's not an easy practice to track, and this book, I think, is really innovative in the way that it does so, and we've been talking about that a little bit already. The community of scholars working on media infrastructures and various offshoot fields, such as studies of maintenance and repair, will find in this book a concentrated test case and a new geographical vantage point for these subfields. It's sure, I think, to be a pillar of the MIT series on infrastructures. The project highlights place-specific dimensions of informality. It shows in what ways informal geographies bear little resemblance to the media practices that tend to follow formal channels. In fact, it raises the question about whether media studies has left far too much of the life of media in shadow by privileging formal media infrastructures over others. Any source of illumination is going to create shadows, right? And single points of illumination, such as the narrow focus on official access to media, create dramatic shadows, right? And we need to kind of think about how we're staging this, this lighting scheme here. Considering the challenges in researching media history from such a vantage point, scholars in this field will also find elegant solutions to methodological impasses. It's no straightforward task determining how an underground had to be built. By interleaving official archival evidence and hard material emphasis on the cassette with oral history and fictional representation, Professor Atwood grasps an infrastructure designed to hide in plain sight. The stories of those involved in the secret lives of videocassettes in Iran provide points of access and forms of reflection that shape the book's voice. Dr. Atwood's expansion of the category of the underground to include the quotidian, I think, has broad implications, right? As media historians further explore everyday mediated realities of what we could call underground media, it becomes clear that we need not always reproduce oppositional, countercultural, or revolutionary myths in assessments of underground formations, right? Some facets of underground media are accurately categorized as oppositional and marginal, but holding on to such categories as a habit of thought, I think, would obscure the ways in which a high degree of official regulation can produce an everyday underground, a quotidian underground that is pervasive in casual office conversations and while socializing at home. And finally, the book is deliberate in the way it does not lay claim to an exhaustive history. It shows why mapping these networks, especially informal ones, should remain a process and not a terminal task. The structure of the book does not follow a direct timeline of the life of video cassettes in Iran. Instead, each section takes on a particular dimension of the network. The conditions of the video ban, the distribution infrastructures, the figure of the dealer, private viewing spaces, and the retrospective labor of collectors. And this structure, I think, allows the book to center the narratives of oral histories and fictionalizations of the trade in cassettes as they move from past events to present nostalgia. In its own storytelling, the book is attuned to recollections of its interview subjects as an intimate narrative mode. Indeed, intimacy is not only the subject of the fourth chapter, it characterizes modes of remembering that run throughout the book. So I do have a couple of questions, as I think we all do. So I'll stop there and we can proceed how everybody would like.
Thank you, Professor Askari. Professor Atwood, would you like to respond to Golberg and Kaveh before we proceed?
Just a response of thanks for reading the book so carefully and thoughtfully, and for sharing these comments with me. They're really lovely, and it's amazing when someone else is reading of your own work and kind of help you understand what you were doing better. So thank you very much for these comments. They've given me a lot to think about.
Very good. Any follow-up questions and queries? Golberg and Kaveh?
So my first question has to do with temporality. And in your book, you mentioned that while most scholars of media and also cinema use the revolution as a bifurcation point, it was the war and not the revolution that most profoundly affected the country's mediascape. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the continuities and discontinuities that the war gave rise to in Iran's mediascape.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, and thank you for that question, because I think it's not one of the main arguments of the book, but it is an underlying kind of assumption of the book that, and I'm especially kind of sensitive to this topic, as many of you know, thinking about this category of post-revolution and what its limitations are. And one of the things that this book and researching this book opened up for me was the fact that the Iran-Iraq War played just as significant a role in determining the media landscape as the revolution did, or as the establishment of the Islamic Republic did. And I think that this operates across, many different zones, we might say. So on the one hand, we see a lot of clarity in terms of what the role of cinema is going to be vis-a-vis the war, right? The state starts pouring a lot of resources into training filmmakers, into subsidizing the film industry in order to galvanize war efforts, in order to kind of rally the troops, both literally and figuratively. So we see certainly the revolution also, and especially Khomeini, had a particular vision for cinema, but that was really put to the test when it came to the war as something that could be kind of harnessed and used to promote a particular ideology. So that's one way. But we also see it with television as well, right? I mean, this is also a space that became almost fully dedicated to the war. There was very little programming outside of the war. And so it also kind of was saturated with the war. And I think that's why videocassettes matter so much. And I think that's how videocassettes kind of find their way into this really complicated ecosystem where all the formal media, radio, television, and film are really being put at the service of the war, and people understand that and they appreciate that. And from my conversations, they weren't even skeptical of that. They understood that that was kind of the role of state-run media, but it left a lot to be desired. And that stuff that was left to be desired could be found on videocassettes, and it could be found in this underground system, in this informal world of media. And I think another thing that's really important about the Iran-Iraq War is that there is a desire to escape it. And people, I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I was researching this book is people's recollections of the war, not as spectacular and breathtaking, but actually as boring. And these long drawn out periods where you have nothing to do, where you can't leave the house, where you're stuck in a shelter, or you're stuck with the same people. And you need something to kind of relieve that, and you need something to mediate those relations. And videocassettes were perfect because they allowed people to stay home where they felt safest. And they gave people a way to kind of negotiate these tensions in the house that were new because people were kind of forced into the home because of the war for particular reasons.
Very good. Thank you very much. Kaveh?
Great. I have a couple of questions sort of about how your interventions in the book help us to kind of think through challenges in media studies specifically, right? And the first one is I think related to Goldberg's distinction between time-biased media and space-biased media, and kind of thinking where video technology kind of falls in that binary, right? There's a move among media scholars, many of them that you cite, to think about media as a collection of objects that store information, right? But to expand the idea of what that information is, right? So instead of looking exclusively at the symbolic communication that is encoded in a piece of celluloid or on a piece of VHS tape, there's a way in which we're trying to figure out ways to think about media as objects of forensic analysis, right? That sort of bear traces of other things. Thinking of like scratches on celluloid or splices on celluloid as evidence of the use of that material, or listening for cracks and pops on a dubbed soundtrack to tell us about the process of cutting, noticing watermarks, let's say from a video store in Dubai, or a degraded image on video as an indication of how many times it was copied and recopied, or looking at the end of the videotape to see the last 5 minutes of something, and so we can get a sense of what was copied over when the new copy was made. I think all of these are kind of examples of sort of forensic analysis of the object, rather than a kind of direct analysis of what is being represented and effectively stored, intentionally stored on the object, right? And I think this offers a corrective to the way that film and media studies has prioritized certain types of films and certain types of analysis, and you kind of run up against this several times and throughout the book. And so my question is basically about these two modes, right? The information that's deliberately encoded on the tape and the information that essentially hitchhikes along with that deliberately encoded information, and how how one type of analysis can tell us about the other, right? So, because I thought it was really fascinating the way you sort of move back and forth between readings of films and then discussions of the hard plastic case of the cassette tape, and thinking about how one form of analysis informs the other. And I guess my question is, I have a few examples listed here, but I'm just interested to hear what you see as the sort of way forward in how those two forms of analysis can speak to each other, right? You mentioned like Annie Hall and Ben-Hur as part of a kind of canon formation around cassettes, right? And so I'm wondering how this mode of analysis that's presented primarily in your book might influence someone who was writing a monograph, let's say, on William Wyler, and Ben-Hur was a central film in that monograph, or writing a monograph on Woody Allen and Annie Hall was a central text in that monograph. So I'll stop there with that question, but I hope that's clear enough.
Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. So this is such an interesting question for me because this was one of the main drives of the book. And I think, because of the conversations that we've had, is I feel like Iranian film studies, if we want to call it that, it's not that it's dead-ended, but it's that we have a lot of rich discussions of the content of films, as you described it, that kind of one mode where we have close readings of films. But we don't have a lot of the other kind of mode that you're discussing, the kind of turn to materiality. And so putting those two in conversation was definitely one of the goals of the book. And as you noted, it was also a constant source of tension in the book. And I think that's because within the video cassettes themselves, this was a source of tension. And I mentioned this in the book, and it's one of the more memorable things that I heard, and I heard often, and it bears repeating, which is many people, when kind of confessed to me that if they got a copy of a film and it was completely unwatchable, meaning like it was so, the magnetic tape had worn down so much that it wasn't even really legible, they would still watch the movie from start to finish. That there was this kind of commitment to watching it, even though the quality was very low. And I think the answer to your question rests somewhere in that statement, right? That that the films that I'm studying, if we want to call them that, don't actually exist anymore. And that's in part because the magnetic tape of a video cassette was never meant to last forever. And it kind of degrades, even if you don't watch it very frequently, it degrades at a certain rate, and eventually it'll disappear. So the movies that people were watching on video cassette in the 1980s don't exist as they did then now, right? Even if that video cassette still exists kind of untouched, it's degraded in new ways, and you wouldn't have the same experience watching it now as someone did 30 or 40 years ago. And so I think acknowledging that is the first step forward, that the diversity of kind of content that was being watched through video cassettes was so vast, and it was also so fleeting that we don't actually have access to it anymore in the same way. And so what we're left with then, as you said, is trying to kind of imagine how the kind of failures of technology, or how the kind of the forensics of these technologies actually shaped viewership. And that's where it becomes interesting. And I think that's what makes us media scholars, is when we think about, well, how did this actually shape how meaning is created? And one of the things that you mentioned that's very interesting is the way in which the people who would copy video cassettes really had to make use of the whole video cassette. And that differs depending on the brand and the kind of video cassette we're looking at and the time period in it was produced. But let's say there are 2 hours of tape on a video cassette and a film is 1 hour and 45 minutes, they're going to make use of that last 15 minutes in some way by putting additional content. And what was very interesting to me is some of the video dealers who produced these video cassettes were very intentional in terms of how they paired a film, for example, with the stuff that would come at the end, whether it was music videos or kind of teasers of other films that were for rent. There was a real kind of intentionality there, which tells us also then that they're likely, the ways in which people consume that content also was shaped by these kind of juxtapositions that were purposefully put in a particular way.
Very good. I think the discussion is really moving in a great direction, and I want to sort of add a new dimension to it. We are talking about technology. We have had big technologies like airplanes, trains, cars, and everything else that moves in the public sphere. Mm-hmm. With video cassettes and tape players, we have a small technology that moves predominantly in private domains. So if we move from radio to TV and then to tape players and video cassettes, the kind of revolution and transformation that they are introducing is not in the public, but is in the private, in the places where people live. And I'm wondering if we can compare tape players of pre-revolutionary period and the function and the role that they had with the function and the role of video cassettes in the post-revolutionary period, and then remain within the domain of the private, and how the private production and distribution embarks major transformations in the public. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned the kind of cassette tapes, and because that's something I think also Kaveh sort of implicitly gestured towards, and it's an important kind of moment in this history of the video cassette. It's kind of this kind of precursor of the audio cassette, which of course played a tremendous role in the revolution. As many of you know, Khomeini was not in Iran as the build up to the revolution is happening, as the revolution's unfolding. He's in Paris, and people are going to Paris and kind of recording his sermons and then smuggling them on cassette tape into the country, where they're being copied and then circulated very widely, right? So that Khomeini's voice is in Iran, even though physically he's not. And really, I kind of pinpoint this as an important, although not stated, reason for banning video cassettes in the first place. I think it wasn't just a matter of control, although that's a big part of it. I think the Islamic Republic in the 1980s had this very recent memory of the way in which this tiny technology, like you said, had this huge public role to play in terms of fueling or firing the flames of a revolution. And I think there was a lot of anxiety that video cassettes could do something similarly. And that's the reason that they were banned, or at least one of many reasons that they were banned, is there was this kind of anxiety about, well, what could this medium do if audio cassettes, created a revolution, we might say. And you're exactly right that one of the things that's happening in the post-revolutionary period is this kind of debate about what constitutes private and what constitutes public, because the video cassette is being consumed in the private sphere, and yet the state seems to want to control it as though it's this kind of public medium. And video cassettes themselves have these different lives as they move through public and private spaces. So the video dealers who transport them, they have to be very careful when they're moving through public spaces. They have these briefcases that are hiding them. They're often caught because this briefcase is kind of a dead giveaway that they're a video dealer. And they're taking on the riskiest work because it's in public. Once it gets to people's private homes, it's also a little bit risky, but it's a lot less risky. And video cassettes have a very different kind of ethos around them. It's a very different life. There, it's a kind of source of pleasure, of entertainment, of escape, of resistance, kind of in the lowercase r form. And so it's interesting to kind of chart this tension between public and private by looking at how the video cassette has different meanings outside the home and within the home.
Thank you. Gulbar, do you want to?
Yes, of course. Blake, as you know already, in the field of Iranian cinema in particular, there are a lot of histories that focus on censorship laws, on laws in general, a very top-down histories that kind of fetishize, in a way, censorship, and celebrate new Iranian cinema in how it has gone, it has circumvented some of these laws, or censorship in Iran in general. And what you do in your book, you actually show that with regards to video cassette and home video sets in general, even during the ban, there is not a single law that actually provides, a very set rule of conduct, or a single law that actually regulates video cassette distribution and usage. So how do you, my question, I guess, is how does this vagueness in rules, regulations, as we have seen, I mean, this is not only in the field of cinema or movies or video cassettes, we actually see it with so many different things in post-revolutionary Iran. But I want to know how this vagueness of rules of conduct with regards to video cassette have actually shaped the video culture in Iran, and how what limitations they've provided, and how have they facilitated a different culture, a different mode of communication.
Thank you. So yes, I think it's worth repeating that this kind of video ban was not consolidated in a single law that was kind of passed and then made public. It exists in a lot of different spaces, and it's not very visible, and it's not very legible to most people. One of the interesting things that happened in my interviews is sometimes people would even argue with me about whether or not a ban existed at all. And I knew it did because I'd found the kind of documentation of it. But a lot of people just felt like there was no difference for them in terms of accessing movies on video before and after the ban, because either way, like you said, their access is being structured and limited in a particular way by policies, whether those policies are very extreme, like a video ban, or whether they're a little bit more generous and just sort of banning specific content on video. There's still these kind of this overall structure that's limiting or allowing for certain kinds of access. So I think one of the things that made this book difficult to write is that it is very challenging to kind of track what the ban actually meant in practical terms at different moments. What is being banned? To what extent is the ban going to be punished? I think that's another thing. I know that it was punished, and I spoke to people who actually received very harsh punishments, but I also spoke to a lot of people who just, easily accessed video cassettes, even distributed them with very little recourse. So this is what the kind of vagueness of the ban allowed for, is, a lot of variability in terms of how it was enforced, but also what it meant. I stumbled across a very interesting document that I think is worth mentioning. It was a kind of memo that was released by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance to the kind of customs officials at an airport, or at the airport. And it was this sort of reminder that you're not allowed to import blank video cassettes into the country. And it was happening quite late, actually, in the ban, like, maybe the mid or late 1980s. I can't remember the exact date. And so you'd think at that point it would be clear that we can't import blank video cassettes. Video cassettes are banned. But like, as I started to think about this source more, I realized that there obviously must have been some flexibility there, or we wouldn't have needed this ban, or this sort of this memo to be released to customs officials. And the concern was actually that video cassettes with content were being imported into the country dressed up as though they were these fresh blank video cassettes. And so it made me think that, like, at some point, maybe video cassettes, if they were blank, were allowed to be imported, but it was just the ones with content that were actually being stopped at the borders. And so that allowed then, I guess, a lot of blank video cassettes into the country, which actually supplied people with access to movies, because, you know, even though this was a very big and wide system, it still had limitations because there's only so much technology in the country. And especially after this memo was released, it was much harder to kind of smuggle in even blank video cassettes that could be taped or taped over to circulate the movie. So the vagueness of these policies actually is what kind of allowed people to maneuver within them ultimately.
Thank you. Kaveh, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Let me look at, okay, I'll ask this one. So I thought it might be good to talk about the way you frame work and labor in the book. And, you know, I'd love to hear more about that sort of methodologically, particularly the labor of the dealer, the work or the labor of the dealer. Right, I think there's this kind of move in media studies, cinema media studies, toward recognizing labor that's previously unrecognized, toward, you know, advocating for books about below the line labor, and to acknowledge that as work that is just as important as the kind of big labor that gets printed on the movie poster and that kind of thing. And I think that's part of what you're doing in the book, but you also take a slightly different approach, you know, particularly when you're talking about the sort of comparison of 19th century poets and the story. I'm forgetting the title of that book offhand, but I'm sure you'll remind us. Because I think in that formulation, there's this idea that it's a turn away from that. This kind of work of the video dealer is a turn away from both profit motivation and even potentially social mobility, right? It's not about sort of advancement, either financially or socially, the motivations of the video dealer. And instead, if I understand correctly, the argument that you're arguing that the work of the video dealer is enacting a certain kind of rejection of the current conditions of labor, sort of more generally, right? That is these sort of requirements of social reproduction, right? That one should go home from one's demanding job and sleep a full 8 hours so that you can be refreshed and productive when you go back to your, you know, your physically demanding job the next day. That this is in some way a kind of a rejection of that system, right? So I mean, I guess I just want to hear you say more about the way you're formulating work and labor in the video dealer, and am I reading that sort of slight shift correctly? And if I am, you know, what does that say about this current trend in media studies to advocate for below the line labor as labor and to sort of configure it in that way?
Yeah, I'm happy you asked this question, because this is my favorite chapter in the whole book. And it's one that I still kind of think about, and I'm still sort of working through the question of labor, because I think it's a really important one to understanding what this underground infrastructure looked like, and who are the people who actually made it possible and kind of supported it and labored within it. As you mentioned, there has been this push within kind of film and media studies to think about the forms of labor that support, especially media production, that often get overlooked. So below the line labor, and especially we might think of people like, you know, production assistants or, you know, costume designers or makeup artists. I mean, these are the sorts of laborers who have been getting more attention within the field, and that's really important because, as you said, it's, you know, these kind of works, especially if we're thinking about a film, are not just the work of one person or the few people who end up on the film poster, but actually a lot of different kinds of creative labor go into it. And I think that idea of creative labor is maybe one point of departure for me. A lot of the scholarship really does focus in on this idea of creative labor, and it's more difficult to make a case that someone like a video dealer who just copied video cassettes and then delivered them to people is a creative laborer. We could make the case that a costume designer is a creative laborer who shapes the kind of the work in a particular way, but it's harder to make the case for the video dealer. And I think, and what I try to point to in the book, is that a big reason for this is that we have villainized the idea of piracy, and therefore we villainize pirates. They're not creative laborers, they're criminals and they're thieves. They're people who just copy, and copying is not creative at all. And so I try in the book by kind of carefully outlining their process and the work that they do to show that this is actually creative work. Yes, maybe at the core of it, they are copying one cassette to another, but they're doing a lot in terms of promoting and curating, filling up that additional space within the video cassette. They're doing a lot to frame how people receive and understand films. And once we acknowledge this as creative labor, then I think we get to your correct reading of the chapter's argument, which is that this is an attempt to take back something. As you mentioned, a lot of video dealers, especially early on in the 1980s, when this work was the riskiest, weren't doing it for the money. They actually had other jobs, and this was kind of moonlighting. And so for me, it became a kind of thought experiment to figure out why they were doing this work and why it was valuable to them. And as you said, it was a rejection of something, and it was a rejection both of their social circumstances, but I think also, like you said, of their labor circumstances. So I kind of bring up one example of kind of line man, someone who repaired telephone lines. And he also moonlighted as a video dealer. And as a video dealer, he got to be this kind of art connoisseur. He got to like go to North Tehran and tell people about movies, and they really took his opinion seriously. And that was just very different from his life. He lived in South Tehran, where his friends had no real interest in cinema the way he did. They weren't cinephiles like him. And even within the larger kind of landscape of Tehran or Iran, where he was kind of considered this unskilled laborer, even though the work he did was highly skilled in a way. And so it was an attempt to rewrite his own kind of labor conditions by doing this work every evening just for a few hours.
Building on Kaveh's question and your response, and thinking historically on labor history and history of labor, I am wondering if we can take the category of dastfurush, the peddler, who works usually in neighborhoods, moving from one place to the other. And at one time, they would have been peddling sort of household items, and later on becoming peddlers in tape players, and later on during the revolution, peddlers in video cassettes. Could we think of it as this particular category of worker, mobile, within the private space, going to homes, and then that particular labor increasingly becomes sophisticated and also politically daring?
Yeah, I think definitely there's a way in which this is an extension, not just of kind of previous movie culture, but like you said, of this kind of category of worker that is familiar on the kind of landscape of Iran, right? These figures who sell things on sidewalks or in subway cars or
back alleys.
And back alleys, exactly. And you know, actually, one thing that I tried to push back against is this kind of mythology that the people who were distributing video cassettes were the same people who were distributing drugs, because this became something that was really part of the rhetoric of the 1980s, is that, you know, and especially through this word qachaq, right, which applies both to drugs and to video cassettes at the time. There's this way in which video dealers are being conflated with drug dealers. But I think you're right that it's much more likely that it's a kind of continuation of this more familiar and, like you said, less political initially act of just sort of selling things on the streets. And there's a really good anecdote that kind of aligns with this theory, which is, you know, Kiarostami's famous film Close Up is about a man named Hossein Sabzian, who imitates Makhmalbaf, the famous filmmaker, and then he gets in trouble and he gets caught and he ends up going to court. That's the film. But actually in real life, Sabzian, because it's based on a real life incident, ends up selling DVDs in a subway station in Tehran. So he becomes, you know, he goes from this man aspiring to be a filmmaker into one of these peddlers himself, right? Just sort of selling DVDs, movies on DVDs. So that we can definitely see that trajectory, and it's an interesting link to think about historically, because there's a real precedent for it.
Very good. Golband?
I was actually going to ask you another question, but I think this is a really interesting topic. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a follow-up question to what Mohammed and Kaveh were asking you, and it's about the labor of the dealer. Because in the chapter, you actually talk about how the video cassette kind of becomes a signifier of social standing in a way. It's emblematic of the rhetoric of modernization. The dealer is considered as, with his knowledge of, I'm assuming his because majority of time I believe they were men, their knowledge of films, they have cultural capital in a way. So I think you make an argument for the fact that the dealing also became about class as well, class struggle, and how the dealers were using their cultural capital, this knowledge of film, as a means for social mobility. So to what extent was this actually true? To what extent did dealing of video cassettes and these dealers, who you said majority of whom were actually working class people coming from usually south of Tehran, to what extent did actually dealing video cassettes, was it, to what extent was it conducive to social mobility? Here I want to maybe push back a little bit against this idea of social mobility, because while video cassette or movies do give them cultural capital, does it actually change their social standing? How are they viewed by these middle class families that have the means to actually get these video cassettes? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think you're raising a really important point, which is that, and I think the way that I want to answer your question is by kind of bringing up this idea that I build off of in this particular chapter on labor, which is this idea of aspirational labor. And I'm taking this term from another scholar named Brooke Duffy, and she's writing about social media and the kind of aspirational labor of influencers, for example. But I found it really productive because you're right. This work did not actually enable social mobility whatsoever, but it was aspirational in that sense. It was people aspiring to social mobility and even getting a chance to try it on for a day or for a few hours, you know, but absolutely not. The working class video dealers that I interviewed are still more or less working class, and all of them really were just video dealers for a few years. So it happened at a particular moment in their life, usually in their early 20s, when they had these kind of aspirations for social mobility, and they thought that cinema and kind of work within the movies, which they thought video cassettes constituted a part of, would allow them this kind of upward mobility, but it didn't in reality actually allow that. And like you said, the other side of this coin is how were they being perceived by the people that they were interacting with, especially early on when most of the customers, the people who had means to do this, were kind of upper middle class. And you know, largely the rhetoric that still exists around video dealers is that they were criminals and thieves. And even if people felt sort of warmly towards their video dealer, they rarely knew their name. And I think that's significant in terms of the kind of social mobility that was actually accomplished.
Please, everyone, feel free to jump in. And as you do, I want to pose another question and see, again, going back to this peddler, Dast Furush, I think for me, it has become really an interesting category, because earlier they were these people who would go around and change the water of the hose, of a hosey, or during winter, they would do a snow plowing, barf paru mikonim, and then during the sort of this electronic revolution, they would sell tapes, cassettes, audio, video. And I'm wondering whether one could not really focus on these people who are dynamic, moving within the private domains, and turn households into direct marketing site, and then link this technological transformation to this particular category of labor. And whether it doesn't really also enable us to think beyond Iranian cinema and see what it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of potential there. And I think the key word there is mobility, like you said, that these are people who have a level of mobility and this
spatial mobility,
exactly,
not ladder going up as Goldberg indicated.
Exactly, yeah, this kind of ability to traverse the city, right, in a particular way, and to access people's homes, and like you said, to kind of transform them either into kind of marketplaces or sites of, you know, media consumption that gives them a particular power. That's very interesting, and it would be worth thinking through because I think, yeah, like you said, there's something special there. And the other thing is not just is also the people, you know, who sell books on the sides of streets, or leading up to the revolution, the kind of offset copies of books that were being kind of secretly distributed. That's also kind of labor that kind of fits into this equation and would be interesting, and maybe the kind of connecting point to thinking about video dealers.
Very good. Dr. Raza Khan, welcome back. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Professor Kohli. This has been a very fascinating conversation. So my opinion are coming from South Asian studies, and I would like to hear your thought following Michael Warner's work on the idea of the counter-public in conversation with the idea of the underground. Now, one of the ways I think your work might be relevant is to also pose the counter-argument to the revolutionary potential of the underground, which is to think of the reactionary appropriation of the underground. And I'm here thinking of Al-Qaeda or conservative group appropriating the video culture regime precisely because of its great potentiality. And there has been some work on, for example, Taliban or Al-Qaeda's usage of the video culture. I do remember that in the 90s, one of the fundamental ways in which South Asian Islam changed was through the import of these fatwa videos from the Middle East, Saudi in particular. So one would be to think of these fundamentally counter-public technologies, counter-appropriation. Is this something that the Iranian regime also, in fact, not just antagonized, but used? That would be one. And a related question to that would be, how do we understand the space of the home that these video cassettes are creating in terms of fundamentally changing the idea of the public and the private? You mentioned about it, but I think I'd like to hear a bit more about what does the technology changes fundamentally the home, as it were, because it's also being consumed in a very private and yet public way. So in a way, what I'm asking is, could you then make larger reflection on what this technological material history might also tell us in terms of conception of changing concept of public and the private? Because this technology is very interesting. It's at the juxtaposition of the public cinema, but in the interiority of home. So, but thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Very good.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for these two wonderful questions and very different questions as well. So to address your first point about the ways in which, as you said, this kind of underground world, which had so much potential, could also potentially be kind of usurped and used by the state itself. In the period that I talk about in the book in the 1980s and 1990s, we don't really see that much. But more recently, it has happened. And here I'm citing a work by Narges Bajokli. She recently published a book called Iran Reframed. And she tells this really interesting, she's an ethnographer, and she tells a very interesting story about a state-produced film that is like pure propaganda, we could say. And there's this real debate among its producers about how are we going to release this film. And they ultimately decide to, rather than do kind of a big theatrical release, they dress it up as though it's a kind of pirated copy of a film, pretend it had been banned, and introduce it into this underground system. It's on DVD now, not on video cassette. But we can see, and actually I'm working on a kind of article now about this, about the way in which the state is kind of using all of the kind of affection and trust that people had in this underground circulation system, and now using it to kind of disseminate their own kind of ideologically driven works. So it doesn't happen in the 1990s or 1980s, but by the 2000s, definitely, it's established enough that it becomes this access point for state kind of supported media as well. And then when people find out about it, as I think you probably suspect, they feel really betrayed by not just the state, but really by the system that they thought that they understood and trusted. To your second point about the home, there are a lot of interesting things happening with respect to the video cassette in the home. One is that video consumption was very much a group affair in Iran in this period for a lot of reasons. Part of it was technological constraints. So one person might have a VCR that would play video cassettes. So everyone would gather in that person's house, family, friends, neighbors, all at once. And in a way, I heard often that, you know, the space was set up like a movie theater. You know, people are like sitting in rows to watch this movie on video cassette in the home. And so that was interesting, is that it was not this kind of personal, although it was intimate, perhaps, it wasn't this kind of one-on-one connection with the video cassette. And I think that's the big transformation that happens, is that it turns the home into a site of media consumption in a way that previous technologies in Iran, I don't think, had to the same extent. TV has a kind of different history in Iran. You know, it doesn't really take hold very strongly. By the 1980s, there are only a couple of channels available. And so it's not this kind of space for entertainment like we see in the United States in the post-war period and beyond, for example. So it was really the video cassette that kind of solidified the home as this place where you could sit and be entertained in this way.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Darvishzadeh, Naveed, please.
Hello, thank you for the great presentations and talks. And I'm also pleased to meet you all virtually. It's always good to put a face on the names that I have read so much work from. So I was thinking, I haven't read the book yet. I have ordered it, but it has not yet been delivered. But so I was thinking two questions that are somehow similar. And there's a tendency when we're talking particularly about Iranian cinema, particularly like pre-revolutionary cinema, to focus mostly on Tehran, because that's where we have the cinemas. But with the case of video cassettes, it is also the question of availability, as Blake mentioned. It was available all over the country. But the experience of using it was different in more, let's say, religious or more traditional cities like Qom or Mashhad in comparison to how it was in Tehran. So I was wondering if this is addressed in your book, that how it was experienced in different cities. And it was also the second question, which is also a similar question, follows the gender norms. And as Mohammed mentioned, if we compare it with Peddler and Das Froush, because we had it historically, they were the people who had access to the private space of the house. It meant that women have also access to these, right? They would come to houses and they would buy glasses, they would buy pots from them, right? They would do other stuff. But in the case of video cassettes, particularly after the revolution, with the censorships, with the more robust roles that we had with the veiling and stuff, women had less access to, and particularly because people who were selling this video dealer, they were mostly men, right? So women had less access to them. And so it meant that their desires and so they did not have much saying in what they are consuming, right? So men would reproduce it and deal it, and also men would decide to purchase it, to rent it, right, to get it. So I was wondering if these questions are addressed in the book, and if you have comments on them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very good and interesting questions, and important ones. So to address your first question about the ways in which video cassettes circulated and were consumed outside of Tehran in particular, I have to kind of foreground the fact that most of my interlocutors were in Tehran. That just is the nature of my own kind of snowballing and how I was able to access people. But I did talk to a handful of people who were outside of Tehran. And that was enough to alert me to the fact that we need more kind of research about media circulation in general outside of these major cities, but also videocassettes in particular. So I spoke to one person who lived during this period right on the border with Pakistan. And his experience with videocassettes was very different. He had easier access to videocassettes, presumably because that border was a bit more porous and it was easier for videocassettes to come in and out of the country. But the content was very different. It was a lot of Indian films in particular, and that also kind of makes sense. I also talked to people who lived, on the other side of the country, kind of closer to the Gulf, and they too had a very different understanding of where videocassettes came from and what they meant, and how they got into the country. So yes, the book acknowledges the fact that this is a bigger history than just Tehran, but unfortunately, most of my own work does kind of center Tehran, for better or for worse. But hopefully someone else can kind of also take up the work of mapping out these different geographies, because I don't want to claim that it was the same throughout Iran, because there are certain patterns that extend across the country, but also things that were very different in different parts, and for good reason. To your second question about gender and access, this was really important, especially I have a chapter about the home and what it meant for videocassettes to enter the home. And as you stated, we think of the kind of the private sphere as the kind of domain of women. And what's exciting is this level of access being brought into the home also meant that women had access to things that they wouldn't have had access to maybe a decade earlier. Because in Iran, like elsewhere, cinemas were often seen as these very masculine spaces. It wasn't proper for women to go sit there and kind of consume this sort of media. And so once it went into the home, it actually opened up accessibility. And one of the more interesting things that kind of reveals this fact is naturally videocassettes sort of lends itself to a discussion of pornography, because one of the kinds of content that's being circulated on videocassette is pornography. And what was interesting to me in my interviews is that the people who often shared with me their stories of watching pornography were women, not men. And this told me something about what it meant for women in particular to have access to this kind of content, and what it meant to enter into the private sphere, where women are really often the gatekeepers, and they get a kind of say of what enters into the home and what kinds of technologies are allowed there.
Very good. And building on the question and also your response, I want to go back to this question of from big technology to small technology. Big technology radically transformed the public space and the public in general. So you had a mode of a stage of modernity that was publicly staged. And then you have this second stage that is private sort of modernity. So you have modernity coming home, homecoming of modernity that starts with radio. Radio is the state controlled, but is broadcasted in public spaces. TV is state controlled, but is broadcasted in private spheres. And then to video cassettes and audio and video cassettes that really become not only produced and disseminated, but become really radically transform the private sphere, and how it really also transforms the male-female relationship and the relationship with the public. It becomes a side of initiative itself. For example, for a long time, I have been thinking of the future of Iran as being determined, but the homecoming of modernity and this homecoming of secularism, that a kind of secularism that is being shaped and formed, created within the private sphere that is increasingly going public. So a lot of us are paying attention to the public sphere of the Islamic Republic, but not paying attention to what is happening, what kind of private culture is being produced that people carry with them within the public. So if we link all of these to a sort of private homecoming of modernity and the transformations that are happening, I think the discussion of the video cassettes, audio cassettes, all of these really are part of this electricity coming home, and then the kind of radical revolutionary transformations that happen in people's private spaces that was really low technology at one time, now becomes really high technology with computers, with, you know, a whole lot of other new technological developments.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think the challenge for us as scholars is to figure out how to study what takes place in the home, right? Because especially from a historical perspective, it doesn't leave behind the same kind of documentation that these big public technologies do. So it's so difficult to know what's happening in the home and the kinds of dynamics that are there. And that's why I think you're right that like the key to understanding both the history and future of Iran is by looking into the home. And it's just a matter of how are we going to do that?
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Gulbar, it seems like you want to jump in.
I could ask a question if nobody else
Please.
has a question.
On
this topic of the homecoming of modernity, actually. I was actually surprised that, Blake, that you didn't necessarily attend to the phenomenon of mahvare, satellite dishes, and the impact of satellite dish on video distribution, on maybe even the lifting of the ban on video. Because now when I look back, I kind of feel like this lifting of the ban and the widespread use of satellite kind of went hand in hand. And I wonder if satellite dishes did have any impact in the media order of Iran. I was wondering if you, in your interviews, you came across any of your interviewees, if they talked about how they use satellite, in fact, to record films, because I know that's something that was happening, music videos or films, and then distributing it between friends, or if the introduction of satellite kind of led to this lifting of the ban on video cassettes, because it didn't really make sense anymore after, satellite became so common.
Very good.
This is an excellent question. And I agree that satellite dishes are kind of the elephant in the room in the book. And definitely I'd hoped originally to focus a bit more on them, but at some point you have to kind of put fences around the project. And I just knew that I couldn't give enough space to satellite dishes. But you're exactly right that, satellite dishes start becoming a phenomenon in Iran in the early 1990s. That's about the time that the ban is being lifted. And certainly, I think in general, and as you mentioned in your kind of introductory comments, this is also a time of like kind of rebuilding in Iran as well. And so it's all going hand in hand. And people definitely, in my interviews, made the analogy between video cassettes and satellite dishes, because satellite dishes, unlike video cassettes, which have fallen out of favor, are still very much alive and well in Iran. And the government has a similar approach to them, right? Which is that they're technically banned, and every once in a while they go around and start collecting and destroying them. And so people that I spoke with, especially when they're looking back in the 1980s, really saw the satellite of today, or even maybe of the 2000s, as very analogous to video cassettes. And definitely, like you said, one of the ways in which, because this is another kind of interesting question, is how is content getting into the country? And we learn I learned through these interviews that, yeah, definitely at a certain point, once satellite dishes become a bit more widespread, people are kind of recording movies onto video cassette directly. But mostly the book is looking at the period slightly before that, right? So this ban period between 1983 and 1994, before satellite dishes really settle in. But I think you're right that once the satellite dish is on the scene, it becomes much more difficult to chart these informal mechanisms, because there are just so many different competing players and technologies and interests, it's hard to kind of keep track then of how people are accessing media at any given moment because they're overlapping.
Thank you very much. We are coming close to 5:30, but we have another question. Dr. Raza Khan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Takoli, and thank you, the speaker, for the patience. The last question really made me ask a question that I have been fascinated, which is the power of video cassettes, not just for consumption, but also self-representation. So I don't know if it is in your book, but what I find fascinating with the coming of video cassette technology was also all these recording of deeply intimate family events, because you raised this question about what will be the archive. So one of the things that I always wanted to record, and Meera Nair has this wonderful film called Monsoon Wedding, in which in fact it is the videographer often who actually documents the most intimate aspect of a family history. So I wonder, and I don't know if this is in the book, but what would be your method to thinking about these completely stranger, often forbidden peddlers, in fact being the archivist of potentially this possible history of family events? Is this something that would be part of the history of the video culture, the underground history of the family? So if it's a speculative question, but I wonder if you could speak about it.
Absolutely. So the book itself, I decided to kind of limit it to pre-recorded content. But that's not how the book started. Like I envisioned telling this whole history of video that wasn't just the video cassette, it was also the camcorder. And one of the things that I heard quite often and in fact, I think what a lot of people expected me to ask about when I kind of sat down to do these interviews was wedding videos, which were a huge phenomenon. And like you said, unlike maybe some of the popular films on video, which no longer exist, these wedding videos still do exist. And so there is a kind of archive for them. And yeah, I think it's definitely part of this broader underground culture, because like I said, even camcorders were banned at a certain point, blank video cassettes were as well. And so all of this, the kind of production of videos was also happening. And like you said, it often very intimately. And it's kind of recording these family histories in a particular way. And it would be an amazing project, I think, to kind of open up that archive and see what spills out.
Very good. Any other questions from our panelists, Golberg and Kaveh, and our guests? No? If not, thank you very much, Professor Atwood, and thank you, Professor Golberg Talai and Professor Kaveh Askari, and thank you all for attending our first Iranian Studies virtual book lunch. And we are hoping to have many more to come. Thank you again.
And thank you, Mohammed, for organizing this, and to Golberg and Kaveh for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blake, for your patience.
Very thought-provoking. Everyone have a nice evening and nice weekend.
Thank you.